Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at the Biotech Showcase's Rare Disease panel. I'm moderator Ritu Baral, Senior Analyst at Cowen, and we have a wonderful panel of experts today weighing in on the value proposition of new modalities versus established ones. We're going to be talking about pricing. We're going to review new pricing paradigms, modalities, especially touching on gene therapy, moving into how FDA looks at these new modalities versus established ones, and round up with some quick thoughts on M&A strategy. So I am going to leave it to my panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe start with Chris Vlahos.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Vlahos. I'm the global head for external innovation for both rare disease and neuroscience at Ipsen, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I've been with Ipsen about a year. Prior to that, I was with Eli Lilly, where I was in a similar role in external innovation, business development, covering cardiometabolic diseases.
Thanks, Chris. Steve Uden, physician by training, obviously from the United Kingdom originally. I've been in pharmaceutical R&D about 30 years. Most recently, got my passion for rare disease R&D and drug development while I was at Alexion. And as a result of that, I'm one of the founders of a company also based in Connecticut called Rally Bio, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, Jeff Mackay, CEO of AvroBio, which is an ex vivo lenti-gene therapy company targeting rare disease and specifically lysosomal storage disorders, so diseases people often equate with Shire and Genzyme from the enzyme replacement therapy days. Prior to that, 11 years as a CEO of a commercial stage cell therapy company called Organogenesis, and prior to that, a decade at Novartis around the world, but primarily in transplant immunology.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Maha Katabi, I'm a partner with Sofinova Investments. The firm is based in Menlo Park. Sofinova manages about $2.1 billion in capital, both invested in private companies as well as managing a hedge fund, which is about $500 million investing in the public markets. My background is in pharmacology, and I've been an investor for the last 20 years, both as a public portfolio manager as well as an investor in private companies. The rare disease space is both a source of excitement for patients and for all the stakeholders involved. So I'm happy to be part of the conversation today and outline some of the recent challenges.
Great. Well, we'll start on pricing. Rare disease pricing has been sort of a lightning rod, maybe not as much as oncology, but because of the economics of R&D investments as well as the small patient sizes, they have these drugs have resulted in some outsized prices and price tags. The conventional approach with previous gen drugs has been population-based. Basically, the smaller the population, the higher the price tag to cover the R&D costs and production. We've seen various graphs through the years about what that population formula is. And one of the easy rules of thumb that we've used is that in Cowen is that if you have a 100,000 patient population, you can count on about $100,000 price, if not slightly more. And then the lower you go in the population, the higher the price. Have any of the panelists seen that changing with at least their traditional drugs? We'll get to gene therapy pricing in just a second, but has that proposition been changing with political scrutiny, and more specifically, has that been changing with health technology assessments that have been used in Europe for years, different ones have been used in Europe for years, and are growing in popularity with ICER in the US? So I'll leave it to our panel to address either of those.
Yeah, I would say it is changing, is that the pressure is mounting because I think the concept of value is increasing. And as you mentioned, healthcare technology assessments have existed for decades in Europe and Canada, Australia, but even now with ICER and others, they're becoming a reality here. So I think the requirement for data for conventional drugs is increasing. It's no longer just going to be what they bear, but how do you justify it?
Steve, as you design your trials, are you getting harassed more by your commercial and your general counsel to include things like quality of life measures, things that they could use ultimately?
Well, actually, because we're a startup, we don't have a big commercial team, so that's
Okay.
how I avoid that, but I'm something silly. I would say no, insofar there is, increasingly these days, there's good alignment in most companies between the R&D group and the commercial group. The days when an R&D team would develop a drug and then, as we used to say, throw it over the wall, are long gone. And in rare disease, that's even more important. And in fact, Rita, I'd even sort of questioned whether the algorithm ever was, oh, the population's smaller, the price is higher. It was always backed with strong health economics and data that could be used in a technology assessment. Certainly in my experience in working in rare disease, there was always a big case put to the payers as to why this price should be charged, not simply because the population is small and we've spent this much money, but look, this is the impact on patients' lives, the reduction in cost to the healthcare system. And I was going, although I'm a sort of an R&D person, probably the least qualified to address this particular issue, what I think is important, and I would advise anybody, whether you're on the commercial side or on the R&D side, is you do need that alignment, and the R&D team do need to be thinking about exactly that issue. How are we going to make that health economic an argument? What can we collect in the phase 1, 2, and 3 studies that are going to help with that work? And even and although I was joking about being in a startup, probably reflecting our Alexion heritage, we're already working up pharmacoeconomic models for the programs that we're doing so that we can start to think about what, firstly, is this program, could we ever make a business out of it, but also helping guide us what are the things that we're going to need to collect and measure during development to support that pricing.
Is that happening earlier and earlier, or
yes,
it is?
I mean, now
Okay.
certainly that, quite frankly, the sort of in my experience, even at Pfizer, well, definitely at Pfizer, Alexion, and now even in our little startup, is you're not even going to get into a project unless you think at some point that you've got a path forward to commercialization, and not just X patients times Y equals a lot of money, but more in terms of how are we going to justify that? Could we ever do studies that would demonstrate that value?
Maha, as you look at early stage investments in rare disease, how do you see, your horizons are very long, 5, 10 years versus most investors. How do you see potential pricing wins changing?
Sure, I can certainly comment on those things. So perhaps starting with rare diseases. So in most cases, rare disease treatments are addressing conditions for which there are no current treatments. And so that also makes thinking about pricing completely different from other areas where you are replacing existing treatment or supplementing them with better options. So that really puts the onus on the management teams and the investors and the shareholders in these companies to start thinking about what could the argument be built on to justify pricing. And so some of the usual things that folks think about are, what are the costs to the healthcare system to care for these patients, not necessarily to cure their diseases, but to help them to alleviate their symptoms and to help them navigate through everyday life. But some of the challenges that I've seen lately is to reflect in health technology assessments and in pricing discussions what new treatments actually do to the patient's daily life, so quality of life measures, but also impact on productivity, on caretakers that have to put their lives and their careers on hold to care for these children in a lot of instances. And so these are much harder to factor into health technology assessments and pricing discussions. And I believe that if we collectively figure out a way to reflect these measures, we can certainly justify pricing that things like gene therapy or other curative modalities should command, because they are paradigm shifting altogether. And so perhaps to add a few more comments, I mean, there are companies in our portfolio and certainly across the industry that are working to build in creative models for for reimbursement that work with the current constraints of the system. And that's perhaps something else that we can talk about, is that there are constraints in the way drugs are paid for in the United States. It changes by country. So in Europe, it's not quite the same, neither in Canada, but that do need to be modified over time to enable companies and patients to benefit more broadly from curative treatments, whether they're gene therapy or cell therapy or other approaches.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. Especially, I always feel like there's a tension between these pharmacoeconomic arguments, cost-saving arguments, quality of life arguments, and the fact that sometimes you do have, or many times you have, orphan disease drugs that are approved on very rapidly on new biomarkers. Where, for instance, in sickle cell, with the recent approval of Oxbryta, there's a debate in the clinician community as to what the meaningfulness of the approval endpoint is. That adds another level of complexity to the payer conversations when you talk about cost savings, when the physicians can't even agree. So I'll let you take it from here. Yeah.
Sure. So, well, just to address the Oxbryta argument, and so this is a path for rare diseases that is well known, which is you secure approval on an accelerated approval basis on a biomarker, but ultimately you still have to run a study to demonstrate a clinical outcome, which will make the conversation with payers easier. And so it's a challenge in the early phases of launch, and one that certainly needs to be navigated to set the right expectation as to what can a commercial launch for a rare product look like in the first few years when there isn't a clinical outcome. But in other modalities where we're not talking about chronic administration, we're talking about cures, I think it really has changed the thinking and now requires agreements to be put in place. So for example, Spark, which launched Luxturna, a treatment for a rare retinal disorders, put in place several options to enable payment for this treatment, which is over $1 million. And so one of the ones that is quite innovative is, rather than relying on traditional biologic distribution where it's the healthcare facility that pays for the drug and then administers it to patient and then asks for reimbursement, but rather to strike a deal with a PBM, a pharmacy benefit manager, and have that become a distributor for their drug, because they have their own system where they can manage the complexities of administering treatment over time and then making the payment outcome-based. And so offering rebates or annuities that are based on outcomes being maintained or achieved in certain patients.
Yeah, and I think, Ritu, I mean, you framed it nicely, that the friction that we face in orphan drugs is that we need to recognize that healthcare technology assessments were built for conventional large drugs. And so it's very easy to list off what are the data requirements and the randomized controlled clinical trials. But then the other bookend there is, if you're looking at a one-and-done gene therapy that tends to get regulatory approval with a single-arm trial, what can be done to bridge that gap, when it comes time to have the reimbursement discussions. And it's not completely knowable right now, but I can say that we at Avro, as we're starting to approach commercialization, sort of define that skill set as something that we have to be excellent at really quickly, and we can't underestimate it. We've recently just hired the former head of health policy at Avexis, and the thought process is, maybe Spark aside, you can count on one hand the number of people in the world that have actually negotiated with BfArM for a one-and-done therapy, and NICE and all of the U.S. payers, and have had to navigate that gap, because of course SMA had unbelievably compelling results, but they certainly didn't meet all of the data requirements of a full-on BfArM health technology assessment. So what we're really trying to figure out is, in parallel to running what could be an accelerated pathway single-arm trial, what needs to be done in T-minus 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, and what are the expectations of these health technology assessment organizations. I would say that there's some optimism, because NICE, for example, implemented the highly specialized technologies, I don't know what the division, designation, whatever it is, department, where they're recognizing that the cost effectiveness threshold, for one, may be a little bit different in orphan diseases. And in fact, ICER has actually also showed some flexibility in changing their cost effectiveness threshold for orphan designation. So I think it's an evolving, fast evolving field, But I think, the easy part is to list what the HTA requirements are. The tough part is to figure out how do you bridge the gap, because almost no orphan drug, and certainly not a gene therapy, is going to be able to fulfill all of those data needs, and yet the onus is on us to address it as much as we possibly can.
Are those requirements looking very divergent between different geographies? Has anybody on this panel had internal discussions about geographies even beyond US and Europe, especially with Sarepta striking the deal with Roche for their DMD gene therapy? Clearly Roche is thinking well beyond into, ex-Western world, thinking about China, thinking about India for gene therapies. Just the geographical spread of how this conversation will roll out. Thoughts?
Well, I'm from Canada, and so I can only talk about our system, which is pretty centralized. We haven't had much exposure in our portfolio with companies launching beyond US and Europe, but certainly we pause when the diseases that the companies are approaching us with are more prevalent in populations that are in the MENA region, or where you need to think about South America, and go to geographies where this is less explored. Obviously, Japan has been a champion for rare diseases for a long time, but if you want to broaden outside of that to include the rest of the world, it will require either out-of-pocket payment paradigms that are similar to the US, or in countries where care is centralized, then it's more akin to Canada. And actually, there was a story that ran right before this conference in Canada for reimbursement of Zolgensma. And ultimately, government decided to pay after significant pushback from patient populations. So I don't think we can underestimate that. Patients will continue to have a great role in pushing and supporting and describing to government officials and payers what these therapies do to change their lives.
Yeah, what we have heard on that point is, the voice of the customer is obviously powerful, maybe not as a primary endpoint, but secondary. And there are companies like Casimir, I think they began as DMD moms and really negotiated endpoints with people like Janet Woodcock and FDA, but really that's been leveraged for payers to really help understand the real value of the therapy beyond the hard endpoints, and that's been included in reimbursement discussions. And to your point about where does it play, as you would imagine, it doesn't resonate very well with the Germans, but certainly in the U.S., it has been, very important supplementary information, and, even NICE has been able to accept including it in part of their view as they assess the technology.
And we also see quite a bit of alignment with the advocacy groups as well, in terms of patient journey, what the needs are, both in terms of designing the trials so we can capture what's important for the patients, as well as going forward on that in terms of a payer, et cetera.
Just curious, from an BD perspective, from an M&A perspective, as you think about indications, does the degree to which the patient groups are organized factor into the equation as to the value proposition of a program?
Certainly that is a consideration as we're looking at it. And we kind of look more holistically at what the unmet need is, the severity of the disease, what the current standard of care might be. Is it essentially to alleviate symptoms, or is it actually disease modifying? And then, of course, kind of a strategic fit as well. So there's a lot of factors that go into play on that. But I mean, one of the big considerations is there a path for registration? And then, working with the advocacy groups, working with the patients to understand what are the important endpoints to them, not necessarily, as was brought up earlier, a lot of the rare disease, path to registration is really modeled after conventional drugs. But in rare disease, it's actually what's important to the patient. And can we work with the FDA, with the advocacy groups, to come up and to an agreement what those endpoints should be?
Have you seen more interaction between the FDA and these advocacy groups in the past years? We'll leave this open to the whole panel. It seems like the FDA is hosting more events at which they can hear the patients, but do you feel like they are actually listening?
I think so. I mean, I was recently, most recently on a panel with Larry, I forget his surname, who ran those panels when he was at the FDA. He currently works for a regulatory consultancy. And it was clear, speaking to him, the FDA is very engaged in this and do see this as very important and are expecting companies like ours to think about how can we design studies and how can we present data that show that the patients your therapies are addressing the real needs of the patients. And sometimes things that we might dismiss as being quite trivial are actually, frequency of dosing or convenience of dosing, which we just think will be dismissed, is not necessarily always the case.
Yeah, and I've attended scientific conferences that were put on by specific foundations for certain rare diseases, where you'll have an FDA or EMA, depending on geography, representative talking about kind of their view on the disease and registration as well. These are interesting conferences because unlike the big scientific conferences, there's a big patient, parent slash caregiver and foundation as well. So it's a very different dynamic, and often you have people in the room in the scientific sessions that are parents that are engaged on the discussion as well. So having the FDA presence there really is impactful.
I would never see, actually in my experience, I would never see the scientific content of these programs where the parents are there as lower than, these parents are usually very well informed.
Yes.
And be careful how you respond to them.
I've had the same experience when Sarepta presented their DMD gene therapy data mid-year at PPMD. I had a list of questions, and I watched a parent get up to the mic and ask every single one of them in order down to p-values and variance.
Absolutely,
And it was incredible. I just sat back and let her do all the work. Well, that's a great segue into how FDA has been looking holistically at orphan drugs, orphan drug review, gene therapy for orphan drug review, and the rise in importance of biomarkers. And I'll throw out something that Peter Marks has said about rare disease gene therapies. He says these are engineered drugs. The biological plausibility of them as engineered therapies is so high that the question ends up being manufacturing, and that because there's such high biological plausibility, they are more accepting of these biomarkers. They are more accepting of novel smaller trial designs. Across the panel, thoughts and observations on acceptance of FDA of biomarkers, novel biomarkers, maybe how technology, new imaging techniques or pathology techniques might weigh into this, and if there's examples of this.
Yeah, I mean, I can give a good example, which is Fabry disease, which is so well studied, 40 years of research, 20 years of clinical experience, and so there's a real richness in biomarkers. And of course, as you said, Sieber, Peter Marks, and others have certainly signaled a willingness to not only review but approve based on biomarkers. And if you look at within Sieber for gene therapy, cell and gene therapy, the RMAT designation, is that they're very clear that if the disease is serious, if you have your CMC house in order, they are willing to, with early compelling results, they are willing to review and approve based on biomarkers and interim endpoints. But then the challenge becomes, it's not all biomarkers, and I think that, Fabry disease, for example, has well-established biomarkers like GB3, lyso-GB3 that you know well, that in the key opinion leader community, they just base their clinical practice on. These are surrogates that they use every single day with every single patient. And yet, from FDA's perspective, there's still a little bit of uneasiness because, how valid are these biomarkers? And
how nimble is FDA? So when I started covering Fabry disease companies, I think there was more of a focus on urinary GL3, and over the many years that I've been doing this job, lyso-GB3 has emerged between 5 and 10 years, and I saw that at the conferences, but How nimble is FDA at recognizing this sort of sentiment change in these rare disease
Yeah,
communities?
so
on
that's
biomarkers?
the the unfair job that FDA has is that we expect them to be nimble, but technology is always moving faster than policy and government. And so FDA for Fabry disease, I think, and you know well, they've been trying really hard not to stifle innovation. So they weren't comfortable with the early biomarkers that Genzyme and Shire and company relied on. They were really reticent to pivot to true functional endpoints or EGFR or so forth because they were worried that they would stifle innovation and that those were long, hard measures. So they sort of experimented with a patient-reported outcome GI scale, but this is their efforts to try to find a way to move technologies forward that had mixed results. And where they've netted out is comfort with a kidney substrate biopsy, and that was the foundation for the amicus approval. And in their recent Fabry guidelines, they've propped that up again, and EMA has approved that as a primary endpoint. So it's not all biomarkers, and from the regulator's point of view, it's like there was this journey, this search to find a biomarker that they could be comfortable with that was, valid is too strong a word, but valid enough that they were willing to base decisions on.
I'm going to make a few comments here, actually. I'll be the usual R&D gloom and doom. So I think that's a great example, Jeff, Fabry's disease, but you sort of the pretext of that this is 40 years of Fabry's.
Yeah.
And I think that I do think the FDA are much more flexible and much more open to these discussions, without doubt. I mean, the data show that. But the good thing about Fabry's disease is there is 40 years of experience. Where it becomes more challenging is when you're moving into a completely new therapy, completely new disease for which there are no established biomarkers. And I think we're doing the rare disease community a disservice if we just say, oh yes, they've got much more flexible. Because our business model is to in-license programs. We're a portfolio company rather than, we don't have a platform. And we do see a lot of opportunities where, in my opinion as an R&D people, there hasn't been enough thought. It's a young startup, they're probably very scientific, and they sort of say, oh, this is definitely approvable based on this biomarker. And from everything we know, this has never been looked at before. This is going to be a big lift. Now, I'll give you a concrete example, because you asked for that. Thinking about the work that we did while I was at Alexion, getting Strensiq approved, which came from a company which you know very well, of course, Inovia.
Inovia,
So I hope you won't take too much offence as I tell this story, Marha. So when the program was brought into Alexion, there were very good, quotes, biomarker data in terms of demonstrating that. So Strensiq is used in something called hypophosphatasia. It's you lack the enzyme that enables you to put calcium into the bone, to calcify your bones. And there was very good data from sort of phase 1b, 2a studies where they'd shown that use of Strensiq could increase calcification on X-rays. But it became very clear very quickly to the Alexion team that by itself was not going to cut it with the FDA. You have to be able to demonstrate that calcium in the bone, its normal bone and function is being restored, and there's a long history of bisphosphonate.
Was that because of interactions with the FDA that
Yes.
became
Oh, yeah.
immediately clear?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it was
ongoing
based on
interaction.
many years of people who've done this very often. So what we did was to set out to find a new endpoint, working with the KOLs, and we eventually came up with some great work that come out of Shriners where they'd been videoing these children, and it was what the POMA, the Physicians Observed Mobility Assessment, and sort of working with the scientific community and then with the FDA, we were able to use these data to then demonstrate that the calcification does translate into a clinically meaningful outcome.
Was that actigraphy? Was that like? Did you actually have
What they'd done, for reasons best known to the group, they'd videoed these patients, going on to therapy, and there was a scale established where you could assess mobility sort of by the physician observing. So they were, they used this scale, and in a blinded fashion, what have you, for the assessors to demonstrate that as these children were treated and as the skeletal health quotes improved, it was actually translating into mobility improvements and functional outcomes.
And did FDA consider that sort of a surrogate assessment, or did they consider that a full-on outcome
That was seen as a full-on outcome, and the drug got full approval. Yeah.
on that?
But it was a lot of interaction between ourselves and the FDA to get them there. Now, as I say, this is in a syndrome where prior to this there'd been no prior art. So the FDA, the word I would use is flexible, rather than they've changed the standards or anything. They're prepared to listen. They're prepared. They're remarkable how much they're prepared to sort of roll their sleeves up and help you with this.
Was this a drug that received breakthrough status? Was this before breakthrough status?
I believe that was
Yeah.
before breakthrough status.
Okay.
That was 2011-12.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that to keep in mind about the FDA is that, yes, they are flexible, but it requires very active dialogue over a long period of time. And so recently, for example, there's new guidance for ultra rare disorders where biomarkers are sufficient for approval without even requiring longer term outcomes to be established. And so that would certainly accelerate innovation in certain ultra rare disorders, but I don't think we can apply it widely to certain rare diseases like DMD, for example, where that becomes the norm, or at least, the FDA would get under a lot of heat if that were the case, I believe.
But it still doesn't say. Have a good discussion here. So discussion panel. It still doesn't say that come along with a biomarker and we'll accept it. There are sort of criteria, and then there's it's worth reading. There's a paper written right back in 1965 where it describes the sort of the things, the links between observed sort of data and the scientific plausibility that this translates into it. So I agree with you, they're much more open to this, but you still have to do the legwork to show that this is a biomarker that's measuring and predicting a clinical outcome.
Were there post-approval requirements to do additional studies to then validate that biomarker with Strensic?
No. There was additional work needed in some subpopulations. But the thing about hyperphosphatase, like many of these rare diseases, is that multiple mutations. So if you've got a complete null, it's a much more severe disease than partial activity of the enzyme. So sometimes it presents later in life, and some additional work was needed around the later onset.
Do you guys think we'll ever see a situation like we saw with the Exondys approval with Sarepta, which was a very, very controversial endpoint of dystrophin expression? The meaningfulness of the expression, the technology behind the assessment of the expression. As you have conversations internally, do you think it's possible to have that level of flexibility again within the agency?
So I'll start and then others can join in. The word never is a very... so that's unlikely. I would, point number one. Point number two, I would counsel, do not build your regulatory strategy on the Sarepta precedent. I'm not sure that it's necessarily done the orphan community a service in the long run. So I think it will happen again, and that there are, whether we like it or not. I remember having this conversation with a interesting sort of activist person who was consulting for Pfizer at the time, and he made the point that one of the problems that we have as the pharmaceutical industry is we're very scientific, and we think that if we're very scientific with all of our arguments, because we're all scientists, or that everyone's going to agree that the world isn't made up of those people. The FDA are also politicians, and they have to be thinking to other factors. So I think the Sarepta case had a lot of other factors that went into that decision, but I'd never build a regulatory strategy around that. And let's really do the best science we can, persuade the FDA that these biomarkers are really robust, and I think that's a much better path forward in the long term. My opinion, it's worth what you pay for it, as they say.
Yeah, I think there's more than one example where all of those other pressures have pushed over the goal line, something that may be sort of in that gray zone. But as Steve said, I wouldn't plan a regulatory strategy around it.
I mean, I can give another concrete example from my time at Alexion, not so much on biomarkers, but around flexibility. The approval of Soliris in refractory myasthenia gravis. If you remember, it failed on the primary endpoint, but was 18 out of 22 pre-planned. Secondary analyses were positive. Everything about the data showed that the drug worked, but it had failed the magic less than 0.05. that was a lot of dialogue and interaction, and the FDA really helping us and the drug was approved and it works well. But again, don't plan your regulatory strategy on failing the primary endpoint, and maybe the FDA will give us a pass.
Another sort of feature of some of the orphan drug trials that we've been seeing is comparison to natural history, especially as we look at gene therapies in ultra-orphan diseases where the plausibility, the viability of a placebo arm or even a delayed treatment cohort for ethical considerations or just feasibility considerations is impossible. How should we think about the potential to compare some of these trial data sets to natural history, FDA's approach? Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that right now as I look at a company under my coverage that is going after Batten 3, Batten 6 with 100 patients, 300 patients, and natural history is coming together. I mean, natural history is not even established. So maybe talk about where natural history is established and where it's emerging real time to this therapeutic data.
So I think the magic word, and then, because I like talking about these things, and then everyone else can join in, so I'm sorry. I think the magic word is natural history study. That, I think, is the key word. It's not a survey, it's not observational data, it's a study. And I think where a lot of people
Do chart reviews count? Do retrospective?
If it's done, so if there's yes, and in fact, I'll come to that in a moment. If it's done as a study with a clearly defined protocol, with agreed endpoints that you're going to measure, and then you do the chart study, what often happens, and you see it a lot with parents groups in particular, there's a well-meaning kind of survey done, and you collect lots of data and then try and make something of it. And those of us who've run clinical studies, you never run a clinical study like that. Because what is it you measure and how do you demonstrate it? To the chart, the other aspect of any sort of using data to demonstrate an outcome is looking at things, is the sort of sustainability of the data. So a chart review that gives you a slice in time, plus some sort of longitudinal study demonstrating a benefit, or the history in a group of patients, is even more compelling because you've now sort of sliced the data into, you've done a cross-section, and you've then done some sort of longitudinal study.
But Steve, would you say, for example, that it's tougher to establish natural history data when you are looking at a disease that has a neurological component where cognition is what you're looking at, versus mobility or other physical parameters
something
that you
more
can measure?
subjective rather than a hard endpoint?
Well, I'll tell you, I think there's a sort of grading, so isn't it? The quotes easiest, for want of a better word, the easiest natural history is something that is extremely lethal fairly early on or with a very rapid decline, because and that I think addresses a lot of the
like need for a ventilator, for example.
Absolutely,
I mean,
yes.
that's the classical.
Yeah, or death within a year of birth, and there are tons of data that demonstrate that's the easiest. I agree with you that the most extreme other end is where it's these vague Friedreich's ataxia and these sorts of things where the progression is variable, the manifestations of the disease are variable. Sometimes some of these neurological things wax and wane. So the more you look at your data, whatever data is available, and see these variabilities, the more rigor I think you need to think about running a proper study. Does that make sense?
The more subjective the endpoint that you're evaluating,
the more important it is that you think very deeply,
rigorously about what's in the chart review, because it may not be in the chart.
It's a clinical study. It's a study, albeit off therapy, rather than get some data and persuade the FDA that you're onto something.
And segment your patient population. In a lot of these rare diseases, whether you are diagnosed in a certain age segment, so from say 0 to 5 is different from 5 to 15, and so on and so forth. And so you need to have natural history that corresponds to the absolute patient population that you have in your study. And so a lot of these things that seem obvious when you look at them in retrospect, but they do require careful consideration, and certainly are a big part of our diligence, at least when we want to fund such programs.
Yeah, and we do the same when we're looking at programs as well, because there's a lot of inherent bias in these subjective, caregiver-reported outcomes. Caregivers want to see improvement, and so to be very careful in how you analyze the data in that regard.
And if we're linking this to regulatory, which I think we are, I think we need to recognize that you know, if we go back to the cell and gene world, is FDA and other regulators have, you know, sort of issued guidelines, whether it's RMAT or other, where they've said we would like a control arm, but we recognize that it's not always possible. In the absence of that, we would like natural history. We recognize it's not always possible, but we need to sort of recognize that natural history is almost like a concession, and so it just needs to be extremely well designed. I mean, along the lines that Steve said, because it's already sort of, you know, 1 degree away from what would really be desirable to compare safety, efficacy, tolerability.
And is there an element of acceptability of natural history when the treatment itself is more quote unquote natural? So what I'm looking at, again, to wail on Sarepta, it's what I do. So they have a microdystrophin gene therapy study that replaces a truncated artificial dystrophin. They also have a program for limb-girdle dystrophies, where they are able to replace the full natural sarcoglycan protein, not truncated. Ostensibly, there's no controversy around the functionality of the protein because it looks just like the natural protein. And the current party line is that because it's the natural full protein, that natural history should be more useful than a artificial sort of construct that is the microdystrophin. Is that something that has does that argument hold together in your experience and your interaction with FDA?
I don't believe so. I've never seen that in the past. And to be honest, I mean, it's really down to, I mean, there are so many steps between administering a gene therapy and having the ultimate biological outcome and expression in the cell and functioning within the cell system that, you know, whether it's the full or the mini gene almost doesn't make a difference.
I mean, yes, if you could replace every bit of DNA that was missing, yes, but to Maha's
how
point,
well
there's
is it
so
expressed
many
and
things, you know,
you know,
the
modification of the
vector,
protein,
absolutely.
etc.
So, and the risk, I think, for all of us is that we all talk to each other in the company, and we know that they're going to have to. You have to reach out and speak to the FDA and lay out your wares and be prepared to be disappointed and be prepared to do hard work to try and put them in. But if at the end of the day it's not going to be accepted, then you're going to have to come up with something else. Limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is a very interesting one. I think it's a great example, and I don't know what the answer is, but you know, it's another one of these things where it is, you know, it presents later. It's less severe than DMD. The path is more variable from, you know, my limited work in the space. So I certainly wouldn't hang my hat on that. I would want to be engaged with the FDA. And to Maha's point, it's, you know, you're going to really have to identify the subgroups. Somebody put it to me the other day, a 6,000 patient natural history study in just a variable group of patients is probably not as valuable as a 200 patient study in the subgroup that you're going to treat. Because, you know, how do you sort? So you need to be thoughtful about what are, especially if you're going to segment, is this natural history study really going to support that group of patients I'm looking at, which could be the rapidly progressing whatever.
Let's talk about some of the alternatives. I mean, one of the things that I noted was a delayed treatment cohort, which was used in the Audentes XLMTM gene therapy study. Is that feasible in many diseases? Are there other options other than natural history delayed treatment that FDA has or EMA has seemed amenable to?
Well, I think delayed therapy. So take a step back. I think the fundamental issues are sort of the ethics or whatever of it. So if this is I'll give a concrete example of one of the programs we worked on at Alexion. This is molybdenum cofactor deficiency, which is now Bridge have taken that program on. Now, this is a syndrome that if you don't treat the child within 24 hours of birth, they are doomed to irreversible death, you know, neurological damage and death within days. You know, withholding treatment there and further natural history work is not needed. When you've got these diseases where it's a much more, slower progress, I think you're going to be on to sticky wicket trying to, difficult situation, bit of English. You're going to be it's a much more difficult situation to persuade them. And to, if you're going to be able to put a group of patients on after, say, 6 months, and the likelihood that the disease hasn't progressed hugely, and the active group go up, and then you put them on, it's an ethical debate, but that's more of an ethics committee clinical discussion, I think, than a regulatory discussion. And there's a lot to be going for it. It's got to be a case-by-case basis, and it's a lot to do with kind of the natural history of the disease understanding. Jeff,
I don't have great examples there, but in our cystinosis program, in order to delay treatment of eye drops for the crystal formation of 72 days, to get a proper washout and a run-in, we just had to justify that we were doing no harm. And anything beyond that, I think, was hard to justify. So it sort of fell within the confines, is that the patient's well-being was put first and foremost from the ethics committee, and they just had to be made comfortable that, sure, we wanted to be able to have a proper, clean trial, but we had to put the patient's interest first.
In our last few minutes, I really want to dig into some of the M&A trends that we've seen in the rare disease space. Putting a lot of what we discussed topics together, we've seen the Audentes deal in gene therapy. We've seen the Spark deal. We saw Alexion buy Wilson's not that long ago. I think it was 18 months ago. Achillion, exactly. That was the fourth one I was looking for. Some of them are gene therapy. Some of them are not gene therapy. Chris, let's start with you. What sort of common thread do you see in, say, these 4 deals? What's the value proposition that somebody putting a portfolio together is looking for? I'll start with you, and we'll move to Maha from an investor perspective.
Sure. So we did a deal last year where we acquired Clementia Pharmaceuticals, a Canadian company, and palovarotene for an ultra-rare bone disease. And for us, it was really to establish our franchise in rare disease. We had made a commitment that we were going to grow into rare disease. And so from a strategic perspective, we were looking for assets that either were going to launch within a very short window, or assets that had just been approved and were on an uptick. So we didn't want to market a legacy product that was dying out. So there was a real strategic point to get in there. So it was relatively agnostic to therapeutic area. We're a specialty pharmaceutical company anyway, so we're used to small footprint and targeted distribution. And so for us, it was really to get this anchor asset and then to build the franchise around it. Now that we have the anchor asset, we did a second deal last year in the same disease earlier in phase 1. We think of bone, we think of musculoskeletal, so we concentrically can build out from bone to MSK, neuromuscular diseases, and endocrine diseases. So, from our standpoint, it was really strategic. It was a beachhead to get in there. We're seeing big deals in gene therapy. And we're asking ourselves as somebody that wants to be serious in rare disease, what's the right way to play there? Is it another, because we don't have an R, we're a development company, so we would have to work with a partner in that discovery phase to enable some of that early research, or do you buy a one-off product? And in gene therapy, is that the right way to go? Because you really have to, from what we're hearing in that space, you really have to control the manufacturing. There isn't a lot of capacity in the outside world to get into a queue and in a timely way. Maybe the gene therapy experts can opine on that a little bit more, but that's kind of what we've picked up in our survey of that space.
Certainly what we think about, and both Audentes and Spark were in the Sofanova portfolio, so we were quite fortunate actually to have these 2 great outcomes happen in 2019. In both cases, the key factor was manufacturing and being able to establish a footprint that represents a complete solution to the acquirer, and strategic considerations play a part. But so beyond that, I guess when we are making an investment and trying to map out who may be interested in the space and down the road, there are a couple of considerations. So being first in class and best in class are two overused terms, but I do think that in the gene therapy space, or at least in the era of curative treatments in rare diseases, you do need to think about that. If you are considering a disease area where it's a chronic treatment solution that you're looking at, then there is potentially room, to come up with better treatment down the road, to segment the market, et cetera, to be the third or fourth product on the market. But when you are running a gene therapy investment thesis analysis, and you are considering, the same disorder with the same gene therapy, but maybe with an improved vector cassette, but if the first one on the market is good enough and it's going to receive significant uptake, I don't know if we're going to see the warehousing effect that we saw back in the day of hepatitis C product launches, and people were waiting for the cure. So there's some of that happening in the gene therapy space, but it's hard to assess how much of it you will see. So it's, for example, in the heme A and the heme B space,
That's a good point. And as far as this, the discussion point about how long our current gene therapies are effective, especially the AAVs versus the lenses, obviously, still an open question. As you think about these portfolio decisions, do you make any assumptions on durability of treatments for AAVs? Are you making assumptions on the ability to retreat as you look 5-10 years down the line?
We're certainly not assuming retreat possibility at this point. And so the goal is to, for us at least, when we're doing diligence, is to be convinced that both the team has thought about capsid design, expression cassette, manufacturing excellence, so that you have the level of purity that would enable you to deliver the best gene therapy possible. So all of these factors, assuming that it is a once and done. Now, there are emerging companies that are thinking about some of the challenges, wanting to re-administer or designing better cassettes or coming up with newer gene therapy platforms. And this is certainly a key area of investment for us. I suspect that larger corporates will start paying attention to some of these challenges, especially the ones that have made the first moves and acquired gene therapy programs, and look down the road as to what may be an improvement and solve some of these challenges, whether it's tissue tropism, redosing, neutralizing antibodies, and everything else. And so that's proper to gene therapy, which is a new modality. But I think across the rare disease space, it's more, thinking about franchises and how to target, specific corporates that are trying to expand in particular disease areas.
And I just say, just to turn, what Chris and Mohab said into dollars and cents. Adentes is probably the most striking example, where if you look at their indication where they have really compelling clinical data, it's an extremely small market opportunity, and then they have preclinical assets. So if you're trying to do a net present value, I don't know what it is. It's terminal value, and as you said, it's the manufacturing capability, and then it's also the corner property. Is a company like Astellas is saying, we want to get into gene therapy.
Why is it so hard to do that? Why is it so hard for a large company to do that organically? And
time and
resource?
capital.
Well, I put it the other way around.
I mean, you think they have the capital, but yeah. Go
We
ahead.
saw the same thing, if you remember 10, 15 years ago when monoclonals came along. Yeah, companies could have built it up from the ground up, but it's a faster move to just acquire the capability and bring it in. So I think that a lot of the big deals in gene therapy are from big pharma, but they're a hedge. And if you go back through the history of these companies, there are these various hedges. There was the monoclonal hedge, there was the genomics hedge. Now we're seeing the gene therapy hedge. You're bringing this in, rapidly building the capability to give you sort of first mover advantage. And if it does play out, you're positioned, ready to go and sort of clean up the market. As I look at the rare disease, it's really like a lot of the other spaces. I think you're either you're going to do an M&A to acquire a capability, bringing in a gene therapy, Roche bringing in Spark. You're either a company that you want to really own the franchise, so that's Alexion bringing in Achillion. You want to own that space to some extent. Ipsen wanting to own FOP, so it's a natural fit. And then the third thing, which I think is sort of, in my opinion, is a little bit unique to rare disease. That the rewards are great in rare disease, but the problem is that as the companies grow, and you're seeing this happen to BioMarin and to some extent Alexion, you reach a point where each of these small indications by themselves are not going to sustain the growth expected, and you can't really mount an R&D effort because there's so much breaking science. So the way to solve that is through acquisition, to build out your portfolio that way.
That's a great point. I think we're at time now. Thank you for all of our panelists, Maha, Jeff, Steve, and Chris.
Thank you,
for
Ritu.
joining us. Thank you.